Thank you, everybody. Firstly, welcome. We are Wednesday afternoon, where I am. I'm not sure where everybody else is, but I think we're all quite close in the SADC region. So good afternoon. This is the SADC Futures training series around building foresight capacity for applying towards climate resilient agricultural development. And we're really pleased to see a number of names popping up that we recognize now. I feel like we're almost as we would know you guys in a training or a workshop setting, so it's feeling as close as we can try and make it. My name is Sabrina Chesterman, based down in Cape Town in South Africa, and there's a number of fellow panelists and facilitators and speakers you'll meet throughout today, and I'll be helping to moderate you through today's session. So just a quick recap for anyone who's new to the series. Just to reiterate, this is a partnership between multiple organizations that have come together to put this training together. So it's the SADC Food and Agricultural Natural Resources Department and CADESA, the Center for Agricultural Research in Southern Africa. It's implemented by the CCAS team, which is the Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security Program of the CGIAR. And it's being kindly facilitated through the SADC GIZ ACRA program, which is their adaptation to climate change in rural areas, with support from the German Federal Ministry. So we are at webinar 4. So virtual high five to everybody who's here with us from number 1. We have been building up a process and training around applying foresight. We are now into the real thick of applying the tools and methods and really understanding how to apply sort of foresight tools and methods to future planning around climate change and agriculture. So just to check who's with us so we can see how much detail we might need to recap on or see where we're at in terms of participants. Pierre will just run another poll. And we want to see if you've joined us for the previous webinars or you might be new to the series. And this will let us know who we have in the room together, but slightly apart. Great, getting some voting there. Great. Looks like a lot of you have been with us since the start, so this is absolutely fantastic. We've got about 75% of the votes, so we'll just get a couple more votes before we close off. So we see where everybody is at. Okay, we got 80%, so I think Pierre can end the poll. Great. So 65% have been with us for all 3 webinars. That's fantastic. So I hope those 65% consider themselves almost foresight experts by now. So we want lots of contributions in the chat box. If anyone wants to say any examples, etc. This is an interactive training, so please feel very much you are now part of the process. And welcome to 2 of our participants who are new. We will try and do our best to bring you up to speed on some of the definitions, but we'll also, in the chat box, Lily will be pointing you towards the resources we already have. And yeah, a couple of people were in webinar 2 and a couple in 3, but fantastic that the majority have joined us through. So welcome to those and welcome back to everyone else. Great. So we also just wanted to run a quick poll just so we know who we have in the room in terms of your background. We are obviously around the topical area of climate resilience and agricultural development, but we want to understand where you come from, where are you represented best. So we'll just run another poll in terms of the category that best describes you and your work. So Pierre, if that's okay to run poll 3. So you can just go through the categories and describe what's the category that best fits your role and your work. Fantastic. Seeing some. Brilliant. We've got about 65% of the vote. So we'll get a couple more votes in, 72, great. Just the last little surge in votes, and then we'll be able to see who we have gathered here today. Great, I think we've got 80%, so I think we can end the poll. We can see who we have here. So the biggest majority of our colleagues here today come from research and academia, 20 participants. We've got a participant from the SADC Secretariat, some representing local or national government. We have some participants from pastoralist or farmer organizations. We have a number from local, national, and international NGOs. We have some development partners. We don't have a media representative, and we've got one person from an IGO. So that gives us a good flavor of who we have in the room, and I think a really good diversity to learn from each other. So again, welcome to everybody. So I just will give, as many of you have been with us for most of the series, I will just give a very quick breeze over the introduction, as you all are quite familiar. Just to let you know, you're obviously part of this facilitated Foresight training series right now, where we're running this 6-part webinar, and we're on the 4th webinar, and we will be releasing a full toolkit at the end of the series, which will have all the information, all the slides, all the exercises, everything and more that you would have seen throughout the series. There will also be a dedicated training website, which we are building with Cardessa around Foresight. And then following this, there will also be an e-learning course. So if you would like to take a certified e-learning course, or colleagues that might not have been able to attend the webinar, there will also be an option to do this online in your own time. So you can download the course and do the sort of e-learning aspect. And for those who've joined us from the beginning, there will also be a certification, and we will have a little graduation in our 6th webinar. So thank you so much to all of those who have joined us so far. And yeah, just in terms of participation, like I mentioned, we have swapped over to the meeting mode now. It's really nice to see everybody's faces, the ability for people to put their hands up and talk. We've got lots of Q&As, and we'll be having a breakout exercise today as well. And we just invite you to be comfortable. And although we are virtually all spread out, we try to make it as interactive as possible. So I think that's the general participation mode. And just to remind you, we're on webinar 4 of the 6-part series, today focusing around how to build scenarios, how to apply scenarios. And next week, we'll be looking in terms of how do we then look at the implications of those scenarios. How do we then think about how our strategies might need to be amended, or our policies or our plans, and then really taking you through the last sort of bits of the framework in terms of reflecting and the strategy phase. And then the 6th one will be all about you and building very much tailored work plans of how you can apply some of the tools and methods you've learned along the way. So just in terms of today's process, we will recap a little bit on some of the Foresight stages. So we're in the 4th webinar, so you have learned quite a bit in terms of tools and methods and definitions. So we'll do a couple of recaps, and we'll be asking you to respond in the chat box. We then have Leslie, who will be leading us a little bit to just excite us around the power of scenarios and how they can be applied. And then we will run a step-by-step process in terms of how do you actually build scenarios. So usually scenarios is a very participatory process. So we have tried to mimic what you would do in a setting, should we have been together in a workshop into this virtual setting. So we'll do a very step-by-step process, and you will have a breakout and a chance to actually practice some of the tools and processes. We'll then have a Q&A. We'll invite everyone to have a stretch, and then we will go through how to build scenario axes, and then also to look at how do you build and develop future scenario narratives. And then finish off with the sort of final Q&A and a roundup also in terms of how scenarios have been applied in the SADC region already. And many of you may have been some of these processes. So I will now stop my screen share and invite Constance to share her screen and run us through the next little recap on scenarios. So this is especially aimed at those who were here for the last couple of webinars. This is a training, so we want to make sure that we are gathering learning along the way. So Constance, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Sabrina, and it's great to see everybody. We're really excited about today's session, but before we jump into developing scenarios, what we want to do is just do a quick check-in to see what we remember from some of the previous seminars. So on the first one, we have a poll, which I would invite Pierre to share. So Foresight is made up of a number of phases and stages. And so we've shown a Foresight framework that we've been using in the training many times. I wonder if you could just click the phases that you remember are in the Foresight framework, so you can check all that you think apply. Are we getting some reactions?
Yes, we have. I think people are just taking a little bit of time to look at them. We've got about 40% of the vote, so I think people are just going through them at the moment.
I have to admit that Sabrina and I planted a couple.
This might be a test, it might not be. We've got about 50% of the vote.
Okay.
I think everyone's still looking.
All right, we'll just give it a few more percentage, because I know not everyone has been here for all of them.
Yeah, exactly. So some people will be
Don't need to
learning the
vote.
framework.
Yes. All right, so shall we just get a snapshot of what we're getting?
Great.
Can we check the results? Oh, all right. So we are seeing that we have folks that checked the input stage, the analysis stage, the interpretation stage, the plan stage. Okay, and I'm just going to start to move us into the responses. So then you have the prospection phase, the reflection phase, and finally the strategy phase. So fantastic. The majority of people got those 7. Let me just move you to, let me close that and move you to the slide that, if I can get it, yep. All right, so let's take a quick look at the phases. Just as a reminder, the Foresight framework, as we're teaching it, has 7 phases: input, analysis, interpretation, plan, prospection, reflection, and strategy. And for each of those, we are looking at a set of questions in terms of what is it that we're trying to learn in that step, but also there's a number of tools that that go along with each and every phase. And throughout, we will always have the inclusion of data, evidence, knowledge, and your creativity, as well as stakeholder engagement and participation. Okay, I'm going to check in for those of you who were with us when we did systems mapping. And that was webinar 2. And I just want to ask in the chat box, what would you answer to that question? Who should be involved when it's time to map a system in our Foresight process? So I am not going to be able to see the chat box, but perhaps if there are any being registered, thank you.
We're just having a couple of people with network issues. So if anyone wants to respond to Constance's question in the chat box in terms of who should be involved, can give her some of those answers.
I remember Justice had an answer.
All relevant stakeholders to the system is from Olaf. Government, Adani from Malawi has responded.
Great.
Me, Lehoho, brilliant. Community.
First and foremost.
Bongani says everyone who is relevant. All relevant stakeholders, including local communities. Gwen has said local communities, and Tombi has said research institutions, farmers, and government. Great, so we're getting a couple of responses.
So for those of you who have not seen what we've been doing with systems mapping, so here is a systems map that we used when we were talking about climate resilience in an agri-food system. And so yes, indeed, we would like to have those represented in the system and those influencing the system when it's time to draw those maps and have those discussions about what are the elements of a system that we need to pay attention to in our foresight process. So now another question. Last week we did backcasting. Whoops. Last week we did backcasting. Can anybody remember one step when of what we did when we did backcasting? So what's the hint? The hint is in the title, looking back. Let's see if anyone remembers a step from the exercise we did. In the chat box?
We have some thinking going on, I think, yeah. So remembering this was a method we did last week, and we ran a little backcasting exercise. Do you remember some of the things you had to do or think? Does anyone remember how we did backcasting?
We closed our eyes and we went to, I'm going to sneak the slide over.
So Olaf has said develop a vision from where we want to be in the future and thinking back towards where did we get there? Gwen has said remembering the starting point, thinking of the journey to where we are now. Ask yourself, Charles says, ask yourself how you got here. Luleka says, thinking back. Susanna says, remembering what we did. Great.
Fantastic. Oh my gosh. All are very perfect answers. So we stepped into the place where our vision had been achieved. And then we looked back to say, what do we remember about how we got there? So I really love the idea of explaining the journey. That's a really nice way to put it. And then we remember how did we overcome some of the barriers that we'd already identified, and as best possible consider when in that time frame we accomplished those. So those are the steps. All right, we're going to go to one more check-in. Actually, I believe it's two. So what tool, this is from last week, what tool could you use to understand the difference between a symptom and a problem? So we did this in a breakout last week. So if you remember what we were up to.
Barriers?
Yes.
Bongani said causal analysis. Gwen, causal analysis.
Woohoo!
Foresight experts in this room.
No kidding. Yes, we did causal analysis. We looked at the underlying causes and the implications. And we also looked at the dimensions around those underlying causes and implications. Now, this is not a question for the group. It was a question to us. There were people asking, so what is the difference between a pathway, a strategy, and a trajectory? And just as a reminder, last week we built climate resilient pathways, which have a number of steps inside those, which are shown on the screen. And then you end up with a pathway action plan at the far end, really getting into the details. So that question about the difference between pathways, strategies, and trajectories was answered by our colleague Philip. And just to summarize, he said, climate resilient development pathways are different from strategies. Strategies are a one-stop process, whereas a pathway is more mindful of what happens in between, from where you are to where you want to be. Pathways force you to expand ideas to an end point and what happens in the intermediate time. And then he mentioned that trajectories and pathways are really not too different. Both are about the journey, there's that word again, to the end point and what is most appropriate to get there. So thank you so much for that review. And now we are going to jump into, if I can get my cursor in the right spot, to the introduction of scenarios. And what we found early on is when we asked people what they thought of, when they thought of Foresight, they said scenarios. So we have been building all the phases to get to today, to get to scenarios. And so I have a quick chat box question, and that is, what do you think of when you think of scenarios? So just in the chat box, what do you think of when you think or hear the word scenarios?
Okay, so we have possible futures, different views, possibilities, different possibilities. We have situations. Dieter has said different development options in the future. I think of possible or plausible futures, possible pathways, possible events, plausible futures, situations. Mulundu has said different ways. Courtney has said different ways to describe future with varying levels of certainty. Getting lots of scenario wording here. Different situations. Bernadette has said possible futures due to choices made. Justice has said different activities or situation. Olaf has said different events, processes, and outcome in the future. So processes, events, and flexibility of options. Okay, we are getting a lot of good definitions.
Okay, so I've stopped sharing my screen and I'm happy to now introduce Leslie Lipper, who is going to bring us into the scenario efforts. And she's going to talk about the importance of scenarios in the Foresight process. So Leslie, brilliant, over to you.
Can you all see the screen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm very happy to participate in this event, and it's nice to be able to interact through this program, which I'm still getting used to. So today, what I'm going to just start a couple of things about how important are scenarios, how do we use them? And I want to give you 3 examples from my experience, but I know a lot of you have also been involved already with scenario work. And actually, I see one of the participants was involved in one of and one I was involved with in Zambia, Reynolds Shula. So I think it'd be great also if you guys would put, you know, what you see, your experience has been and how scenarios have been used. So, but let me just go ahead and give you these 3 examples I put together. So the first one comes from a project I worked on when I was working with FAO, and it was a project on climate smart agriculture. And one of the main outputs of the project was to develop an investment plan for the agricultural sector based on potential impacts of climate change. So it was, you know, you come up with a regular type of investment plan. We're going to do this much of this kind of crop, and it's going to need this kind of budget, and then agri-value chains, that sort of planning. And in the same project, we did participatory scenario building. So at the country level, in this case, I'm talking about the Zambia example, but it was Zambia, Malawi, and Vietnam. All 3 countries did the same thing. So we had these scenarios, and the investment plan and the scenarios were done in separate workshops and processes. It took like about 3 years for the investment proposals. And then we used the scenarios that were built to stress test the investment proposals. So you can see on the slide, there's a little more detail on exactly how that was done. But basically, let's say you had a future where you had no trade, a big breakdown in global trade. And in your investment proposal, you had something like, we're going to build up our export sector. So then the question is, what do you do? How, then maybe what do we do about this investment proposal, given that this is a possible future? So a lot of it was, it didn't necessarily change the investment proposals. In fact, as far as I recall, it didn't change it, but it put in sort of contingency plans for how to manage that. So that's one example of how it was used, and it was actually quite useful. A second one just came up recently, and I was reading an article about the US response to the COVID pandemic, which I guess we all know has not been ideal. And so there's a magazine article talking about the fact that the US had developed a national pandemic strategy, and that they had run scenarios for what would happen if they had something like a pandemic. This is before COVID. This was like in the early 2000s. It was after 2005, actually, sorry, with the swine flu outbreak. And in this article, I love this term. They said they focused on gray rhinos, which means it's something big under the water that eventually is going to come out. So it's not unexpected. You just don't know when and where it's going to come out. So in fact, the pandemics, these COVID, the coronavirus pandemic was something it was known that it could be a problem. The US government ran different kinds of scenarios. Okay, what do we do if it's this kind of infection rate? What do we do if it starts here? What do we do? So they actually had some very detailed scenarios and plans of how to use them, how to respond. But of course, the bottom line of this article was that despite all this elaborate planning, it wasn't useful because it wasn't implemented. So that's sort of a mixed example of how it can be useful, but has to be applied. And just a brief timeout to look at some of these terms of, that you see in the scenario building, the futures world. You have wild cards, you have black swans, you have gray rhinos. So the gray rhino I just was talking about. I think probably you all, even in the course of these webinars, we've been talking about black swans, but they're much more unknown than the gray rhino. Like, okay, we know that there's a pretty good chance there's going to be a coronavirus, whereas a black swan event would be something that you really couldn't predict, like say a major earthquake in a place that has no fault, so that you wouldn't expect it. And a wild card, I think you'll be talking a lot about those. They're low probability but high impact events. So the last thing I'm going to say about the importance of scenarios, and this I'd be curious of people that have participated in scenario building to get your take on it. For me personally, and again, researchers, academics, this is pretty key. We go into looking at problems a lot of times with our assumptions of the way the world works and what's important and where we're going to go. And for me, sitting through those scenario workshops, it was really interesting because you had a mix of stakeholders. You had government, you had civil society, you had academia, and they had really different takes on what was important. And so, for example, like there was I just assumed that the growth in the smallholder farming sector is a key part of economic growth. Well, not a lot, that wasn't necessarily agreed upon. Also, the role of China, this was a big issue in the Vietnam case. It wasn't totally, people didn't see it in the same way. And so the world they were looking at towards the future was quite different. So just the process of going through that makes you question your own assumptions, and I think it gets you to do better work. And then finally, the thing I thought is very nice, and I think we'll see more of it today, through this process of talking and interacting on these different specific indicators, you start to realize, like, actually there's a lot of things we do agree upon, even when you really disagree on a lot of stuff, that there's certain basic things that here's what we could build around. And it also gives you an idea of here's the things that really we're going to have to deal with in trying to move forward with different points of view and maybe conflicts over how to move forward. So those are my 3 examples. I think, let's see, what's the next slide? Then we're going to move into overview of scenarios, and I'm going to stop sharing mine.
Okay, I am just going to share my screen now, and we'll get into the overview of scenarios. Thanks so much, Leslie. So really, one thing that we heard from Leslie is that it's really important to do them and then to pay attention to them once you've done them. So they have a very strong power. And thank you for those introductory remarks. So today is all about scenarios. And so what we are going to be doing today is we're going to focus in on the one phase in the Foresight process. The question, what might happen that we have not thought about? And we're going to be working on tools today on developing scenarios, identifying drivers and critical uncertainties, and then developing plausible future scenarios. So Leslie's already recognized that there are a number of colleagues that have been involved in developing scenarios. So we have a quick poll 5. And if that one could be brought up. Great. So what is your experience with developing scenarios? I'm new. I've been involved in workshops, developing those. I've actually facilitated or taught scenario development. Let's see how we are.
Great. We have about 65% of the vote. 70%.
Wow, that was fast.
We'll just get a couple more of the votes in.
Thank you for that, Sabrina.
Maybe just a couple more. See if we can get a couple more votes.
We just like to have a sense of your experience, and always happy to hear your insights if you've done this before.
Great. Thanks so much, Pierre. I think we can end the poll.
All right. So 2/3 of us are new to developing scenarios. Another almost 30% have been involved. And then we've got a few who've actually facilitated and taught scenarios. So it's a pity that this is all anonymous, or we'd be calling on you. So thank you so much. Let me just close that. And so let's get going with scenarios. So scenarios are a means for considering current policies, plans, and decision-making processes in light of potential future developments. And I think this graphic on the right really helps us visualize the idea of future state. So scenarios are used as a method to think about the possible future states and how uncertainties, as Leslie has pointed out, might play out. So we're just going to keep inviting people to register questions in the chat box as we go along for our question and answer session. So what is the method, actually? So we use scenario development in Foresight to understand those high impact and highly uncertain drivers and use those to describe future states. So although we address scenarios and uncertainty, they are definitely not predictions or projections. They're not true or correct or wrong. They're only plausible. And they're really used, as Leslie's also said, to test whether our policies and plans and decision-making processes might be ready to address multiple potential futures. So we apply it in the prospection phase, and scenarios do have an explorative character. So we use them to describe a range of alternative plausible futures. So what may happen that we haven't already thought of. So let me just get into the weeds a bit. So scenarios are storylines or narratives. They answer what if questions to describe these multiple alternative futures that span a set of critical uncertainties. And we use scenarios to identify future drivers of change and then plot out plausible directions that those could take. So now, each storyline or narrative that we describe should be plausible, meaning it's reasonable to assume the scenario could happen. So plausibility is not meaning that the future situation will happen, but that it could happen. It's viable. It could be done. It could occur, and it's feasible. It's both possible and practical. And just to reiterate, not predictive. Scenario storylines are participatory. We bring together multiple viewpoints. We bring together evidence, but we are not being predictive. And we'll come back to that a bit later. So today I just want to talk about the, these are the steps we're going to go through today. These are the steps for getting to our scenario narratives. So first, we're going to define the focal issue, relevant time frame. We're going to group, we're going to identify and brainstorm our drivers and group them into categories that we can work with. We're going to identify high impact and highly uncertain drivers. We're going to select those that are both highly uncertain and high impact. And then we're going to set up our scenario axes and build our scenario storyline. So we're going to revisit these steps throughout today's session. And so we'll always show you where we are in the process. So now we're going to first, before we get started, we're going to define our focal issue and our relevant time frame. So as we move into this, I want to ask a quick question. So thinking of your personal work or the situation where you could develop a scenario, what might be the theme of those scenario development and what might be the timeline? Because that's our first step, is to really sort of define the boundaries around which we're working. So we said we're working on climate resilience and agricultural systems, and we're usually working with a sort of 2030 block. But what kind of, what would describe the sort of scope, the theme and timeline of where you are going to apply scenarios? So if you just get a couple of answers, that'd be delightful.
And I think Gwen might have had predictive powers because she'd already put in the chat box about be interested to apply scenarios to explore a common approach with smallholder farmers wishing to access markets. So Gwen has already put forward one as a sort of practical example.
Great.
Anyone else in terms of if you were to do a scenarios exercise, what's the sort of topical area you have right now, and maybe a timeline? Is there a theme you're working on, or a specific policy framework, or a strategy? What would it be? What would come to mind if we said run a scenarios exercise now on topic X? Okay, we have tourism over the next 12 months. Yemi's talked about deforestation and forest degradation over a 25-year period. Olaf said about scaling land restoration globally over a 10-year period. Justice would apply a scenarios process to accessing finance. Bongani has said about exploring smallholder farmers' response to drought over a 10 to 20-year horizon. Nicole has talked about a local climate situation in a given region. Umzi says how to reduce impact of drought in the next 20 years. Dieter is talking about sustainable agriculture in one region of a country. So that's at a regional place within a country over a 15 to 20 year time frame. And Zulu has talked about reforestation. And Bongani from Eswatini has talked about reducing soil erosion in 10 years. And
brilliant.
We do a lot of work in Eswatini, so we definitely know about the degradation issues there. And Courtney lastly has said adaptation to climate change for smallholders in maize growing areas in Southern Africa and policies that could respond to this. Great, thank you for these really practical and examples. And I would say to hold on to these, because this is what webinar 6 is about, as well as building a practical action sort of toolkit for yourselves of how you could move forward with these tools and leaving the training.
Thank you so much to everyone. It's brilliant to hear about these contexts and the timelines. So just for today's purpose, I'm just going to define our theme and timeline. So we are considering the agricultural food system and climate resilience. As we've shown a number of times, there are many, many elements that can be taken into consideration in an agri-food system. And then we also have spoken previously about climate resilience, taking into account the kinds of efforts that could be undertaken, including those associated with adaptive structures, people's capacity to adapt, proactive institutions and organizations, ecosystems, services that build resilience and also enhance livelihoods and farm functioning. Again, we're going today to choose 2030 because it certainly reflects the SADC climate change strategy as also. So we're going to use those, and now I am going to close my screen and invite Sabrina to take us into step 2.
Thanks so much, Constance. And thank you to Pierre, our technical host, and our time whip has told us to keep going. So I will make sure to try and catch up a little bit. So I think the next sort of part in terms of the framework and the way we are running through and building a scenarios process is really identifying and brainstorming what they call these drivers of change. So you've all just given some really good examples of where you would apply a scenarios kind of process. And so in that setting, there are definitely different drivers that are causing and impacting future change. So just to give a couple of definitions, just so everyone feels comfortable. I know we have a few people new to scenarios processes, so we want to make sure that everyone feels comfortable with the definitions. In terms of drivers, really, you can think of these as factors, issues, or trends that cause change, thereby kind of shaping or affecting the future. So the drivers are the things we really try and unpack in a scenarios exercise. Within a driver, you can have internal drivers. So for example, this is something that's an internal force of change. So if you were thinking of a smallholder exercise for scenarios processes, you could say, are there specific drivers that are internal to that farm or that community that might be directing the decision making of that particular farmer, for example? So that's a very internal driver that's specific to that location. And then external drivers are those kind of external forces of change. So for example, political factors or market drivers that might be on a much sort of wider scale. And then when we describe them together, we call them driving forces. So this is when we cluster these kind of individual trends. And if we say these drivers are all moving in a certain direction and are kind of broad in their scope, but also we know that they could be quite long-term, this is a really strong driving force. So in our region, climate change is widely considered a very strong driving force in the SADC region. And it's a driver that's pretty apparent in many of the places that we are. So we had a couple of examples, and I'll just ask you to register as I move on. But thinking of the situation that you've just described, so you've all given some practical examples of how you would do a scenario. Can you quickly think what would be a relevant driver that you would do? What would be a relevant driver that comes to mind when you start thinking of some of those scenario exercises? So what's affecting the situation that you want to understand more about? So we will come back to those and reflect on those a bit later, but I'll just move on because of time. So what you do, and like what I've just asked you to do in the chat box, is the first part of this kind of exercise is just a really wide brainstorm. So like Constance said, for the examples and the way we're teaching right now, we have chosen the agri-food system as our kind of key larger scale theme. And so in this, the first part of a scenario exercise is to have a kind of wide, open brainstorm. So really not having to think too broadly, but just thinking and rapidly. And so if you were running a scenarios exercise, or if you were doing this in a meeting setting or a planning setting, you would get your stakeholders to just quickly think, okay, what are the drivers, and put those together. And it would look something like that. And then the next phase of once you've got your drivers, you've got this big kind of brainstorm of things that might be affecting the future. You then have to group those drivers into categories so that we can unpack and understand those a little bit more and then move towards our scenario process. So for the training, we've given an example of some of the categories for organizing drivers. And I think you've seen from webinar 2 when we looked at trends analysis, and Leslie gave us a kind of way of organizing trends. We look at categories because it helps us branch out a little bit from what we're maybe used to. So Leslie gave a good example. She's a very experienced economist. So often economic things come to mind. I come from more of a climate change and natural resource background. So to me, I always think of ecosystem services and environment. So those drivers are closer to me. But having a category system or thinking around like more broadly forces you to kind of like think of drivers outside the box. And the whole reason of doing scenarios is we start to predict and be able to think of kind of a combination of unusual drivers. So then what would happen is you would then, from that big brainstorm, you would then start to group them and say, okay, in terms of sociocultural drivers, we might actually put these into a bundle. So we might say nutrition, level of conflict, human health, is this a socioeconomic driver? And often, to be honest, you swap between these categories, or there can be drivers that fit across different categories. So this is not a perfect bundling always of drivers. The same thing, we'll just give 2 examples. So economic, you would then also put drivers such as changes in food price or levels of unemployment, etc. So this is your step where you're bundling and categorizing your drivers. So what you would come out with from this step in the process is then we chose 5 categories. And so what we have is basically 5 sets of different drivers categorized under these headings. So we had our categories were around agricultural productivity, economic and sociocultural. I've just shown you what it would look like, natural resource management and governance. So this is how you would kind of get to an organization around categories. So we now have a huge brainstorm. We have many drivers and we've now grouped them in terms of categories. So what we really need to do, and this is a kind of the crux of the start of the scenario process, is really trying to identify which of those are most highly impactful and which of those are highly uncertain, because that's what we want to run a scenarios exercise on. The drivers that we know more about, we're more confident about how they'll emerge in the future, but the ones that are most uncertain and the ones that are highly impactful, they're the ones we really want to unpack. So just to go over it quickly, because this will be what you will do in your breakout exercise, impact refers to the potential scale of impact of the driver on your theme. So this impact might be economic, it might be health, it might be biophysical, etc. It depends what your theme is. And then uncertainty in scenarios refers to how much or how a driver will emerge or play out. And it's important to note, uncertainty can also be, it's not always that it's high in probability, so that might not happen. It's often we have high uncertainty because we have little knowledge on how that may pan out. And then critical uncertainties are really how we group those drivers that are both high impact and highly uncertain. So just before we've split you off into groups, we thought we'd run just a little practice together in terms of the chat box. So we want you to be ranking. This is the part where you have to really take your big brainstorm of drivers that you've done into categories, and then you have to decide for our theme and our question, which are most impactful and which are most highly uncertain. So in the chat box, when we think of drivers that we consider highly impactful in terms of climate resilient livelihoods in the SADC region. So if you were thinking of the future of livelihoods that were resilient to climate change, what do you think are the 2 sort of key drivers that might be really highly impactful? So I'll ask you in the chat box just to share your view. You can see.
Hey, Sabrina, so Justice is saying number 4, the unemployment rate.
Sure.
Are there others?
going to be really important in terms of affecting livelihoods. So these are the kind of drivers that we would think, okay, these are quite highly impactful. We want to take that forward.
Okay, and from Lisa, 3 and 1.
So population growth and level of extreme poverty. So these drivers are going to be really important in determining our future livelihoods. Great. So this
there's
is
strong agreement on many of them. Thank you.
Yes. So this is the first step about impact. And then if we were to ask the same question and say, okay, which of these drivers are we least certain on how they will develop? What do you think of? Do you think population, we really know how it will develop in the region? Or regional integration, we're quite sure of how that will happen, or land degradation? Which one or two drivers pops out to say, actually, I'm really uncertain about how this will happen in the future? And I can just see, so land degradation, yeah, unemployment rates, land degradation, yeah. So urbanization, we're not so sure, some people. Okay. So I think what you're seeing is this is the kind of crux of the exercise. Now you have a chance to go into breakouts. Yeah, so just quickly to summarize, we're finding this is the way in a scenarios exercise that you really try to move and start to say, okay, what are the 2 drivers or the 3 drivers I want to start my scenario exercise on, and really build out sort of future storylines. So we will be breaking you into 7 groups. We've got 7 moderators waiting in the wings. There will be 7 groups. So myself taking group 1, Lily and Amanda group 2, Claire group 3, Leslie group 4, Philip group 5, Laura group 6, and Constance group 7. We will have 15 minutes in our breakout, and then 5 minutes to come back and report back in terms of what we were finding in our discussions in your breakout. Please feel free, if you want to turn your mics off or load your videos when you're in your breakouts, you'll be able to meet some of your fellow participants a little bit better. We are going to now be trying to then select under different categories. In your group, you'll be discussing one category. So for example, your group might be discussing around sociocultural drivers. You will then be trying to look and select drivers that are both highly impactful and highly uncertain, because these are what you take to then build your next step in terms of your axes and your storylines. So your moderator will talk you through this. In terms of how we've grouped these drivers, again, like Constance gave us the theme, in terms of what we're doing in the training is we're building practical examples around climate resilient agricultural systems. We have our scope in terms of the SADC region and our timeline in terms of 2030. So again, your moderator will go through this and you're basically trying to select impactful drivers and uncertainty. And you actually might disagree. You have a table that you're going to fill out, which will look something like this. So under agricultural productivity, we've listed some initial drivers for discussion, and we'll then categorize them. You might throw some of those drivers out. You might add some new ones, and you can also use your breakout if you want to discuss, and you want to discuss with your moderators a little bit more around these definitions. So I would now invite Pierre to break us off into these 7 groups, and hope everybody enjoys the breakout and gets a chance to meet and discuss a little bit more with the participants.
Yes, we've done breakout room last week if you were with us in the previous webinar, so you know how it works, or probably you've done another Zoom meeting. So I'm going to open the breakout rooms now. You'll be brought there, and then when the time is up, you'll be notified. We'll also give a 5 minutes warning, but don't worry, each group will have its own facilitator, as Sabrina suggested. So you're all in good hands. We'll see you back here in 15 minutes. Enjoy the breakout. Yeah. Everybody should be coming in now. Oh, you really used till the very last second, huh? The countdown is a bit cruel, isn't it?
Jeez, we were just getting going.
Wait, I don't think that was really 15 minutes. I'm sorry. Did you
No,
cut
it
the time?
It was 15.
I want to check on the clock.
Yeah,
We
I
can
think there was a bit
we
of an
can
issue
check.
there.
It was 15 minutes. 15 minutes go fast, huh?
Yeah, but I think
Goes very
that is-
fast.
Like 5 minutes.
Was 15 minutes plus 60 seconds before it closes. So it was actually 16 minutes that you had.
Really?
Oh, God, no.
Yes.
Okay.
Not like 5 minutes.
Okay, yes, no, we're all feeling absolutely slighted. And I know I want to go back into group 7 right now. So can we just get some feedback? Is anybody, let's ask some colleagues to share. Let's just go quickly by group, see if we have enough time. Sabrina, will you keep us on track? And so group 1, did you find any that were high?
So I'll invite Grace. She will just give a quick response on some of our discussions, because we actually got into the weeds on some of the actual drivers and agreeing around them. So Grace, do you want to give a quick summary of our discussions?
Okay, would you share our drivers?
Yes, I can actually do that. So we were discussing agricultural productivity.
Yes, so we picked on so we talked that we had a heated discussion, so we didn't get to discuss all of them, but on the level of crops and pests, specifically, for example, like locusts, we thought it would have a high impact on crops. As I mentioned, it would due to climate change and maybe droughts and all that, then maybe our crops would fall more victims of locusts as compared to other plants. And so the impact of level of crop pests would be very high. And we are very, depending on, compared to what has happened, like currently in East Africa in the past, then we would say we're very certain on the impact of the level of crop pest on productivity. And we had compared the labor and level of labor and level of mechanization, and considered the fact that the level of labor would have less impact on productivity as compared to the changes in the level of mechanization. And we expect, because of the trends in the introduction of technologies and yes, the mechanization of agricultural operations, then we are very certain. So the level of uncertainty is low on the impact of level of mechanization. And since we didn't finalize, then I might just confirm the level of certainty on the level of labor on agricultural productivity to be relatively low. So we are very certain that we know that the labor will not impact so much on productivity.
Thank you
Great.
so much,
Thanks,
Grace. All right, so let's go quickly to 2. We can't really afford the time for so much detail. If you could just highlight a driver that you found to be high, or a driver that you want us to hear about. Group 2, who's going to be talking?
Yes, I'm going to be talking. So just quickly, so we looked at natural resources and the environment, and the driver we agreed on both to be highly impactful and highly uncertain is the variability of climate or climate risk. So this is the one that we considered highly impactful and highly uncertain. About the drivers related to the changes in sources of energy or pricing and the level of access to renewable or non-renewable energy. We were split regarding both the impact and the uncertainty, but then we didn't really have the time to unpack this, but this was really interesting to see the different
Thank you so much, Group 2. Group 3?
Hello. I will feedback because I wasn't able to press gang. I ran out of time with the countdown to try and press gang somebody to feedback from our group. So I won't put anybody on the spot. But I would say that we were looking at socio-cultural drivers, and we had some debate about what's social cultural, what's economic, and some things cut across and could be in both groups. And I think the one driver, the food security driver, was the one that we considered to be the high, and there were lots of others which would have a high impact, but we had a fair amount of certainty about the likely direction of change over the next 30 years. And it was the food security one that was the one that we felt had high uncertainty because of impacts of drought, production, trade, all of those sorts of things that might affect that one.
Okay, I'm not actually going to go in order. Thank you so much, Claire. I'm going to ask Sunshine to just give a couple from sociocultural as well. Mr. Sunshine?
Yeah, thanks, yes. Constance. May I request if you can share the screen? I couldn't.
I'm going to ask you to remember what we thought was high.
Yes, I remember. Yes, I remember. I just wanted to see because I lost the screen.
Sabrina, can you share your screen, please? Do you mind?
Oh, yeah,
you had it up just a second ago. And we're going to have to move really quickly. We can't read them all. Just
yeah, I'll be quick. I'll be quick. Yes, I won't read. Yeah, it's group 7. Group 7. I see down there. Yeah, yep. This one. Yeah, in fact, we found about 2. We found about 2 which were high, the level of conflict and migration. And then we added the new one, as you can see there, the existence of functional policies. The group was discussing that, the most critical there is mostly usually the implementation thereof, which means the mechanisms to implement the policies. They could be very good policies, but if there's no implementation, is a problem. And then the last one I can mention is the one on the level of food insecurity. It's also high, but we felt we have a level of medium ability to detect in terms of how it is likely going to turn out to be. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Sunshine. All right, couple of quick responses, please, from group 4. Uh-oh.
That would be me. Can you put up the screen? Okay. And thank you to the group for being very patient.
You can tell who was leading.
Well, actually, our group was very active.
That's what I mean.
Okay, so basically, decentralization is a very impactful factor in the political institutional world, but considered to be probably more certain, less uncertainty there. Whereas the one on environmental management, if you go down a little bit, there's a lot of legislation, but the enforcement is the issue. And there was some discussion on, is it really, do we just need stronger enforcement or changing the way the law, the incentives for people to obey the law, essentially. And that it was also we didn't have enough time to really get into it, but it's uncertain. It's been an issue over many years about effective enforcement of environmental management legislation. It's important, but it's pretty uncertain.
Thank you. Fantastic. Okay, economic, group 5. Who's going to present?
Okay, very quickly, like 20 seconds. I mean, the thing that struck me here was that actually on many of these, there was quite a wide range of viewpoints, which I thought was interesting. So I mean, in a real workshop setting, you need to try to get to some consensus, which will take a long, much more than the time available, obviously. In terms of a high, we thought, yeah, changes in food prices will have a high impact, but high uncertainty also. And one of these around regional trade could have very high impact as an adaptation option, for example, if we were being able to, commodities were able to move freely around the region. Okay, that was from group 5.
Thank you so much. All right, and Zulu, you're going to present for group 6. Zulu,
okay.
brilliant.
Yeah. Yeah, we talked of the level of crops pest locust. The group said it was high because of climate change and other things. We don't know what can happen. Maybe these locusts might extend to other countries. So if anything is not being done so quickly, it poses a very big danger. Then the animals' disease, they are quite high, not only on the regions where they are bordering with wildlife, but also the where they are bordering with other countries, like where I'm coming from. Animals, you know, come in and out. So that one is quite high as well. And then the presence of productive input, this one is high. Africa, Southern Africa, 80% of the people live in the rural areas. For them to have the inputs, most of the time the inputs becomes very late because of the terrains and other things. So this is quite a big problem. And then the level of labor is quite high. The reason is that we have few commercial farmers who can afford to have machinery, but 3/4 of the Southern Africa communities are based in the rural areas, and they don't have the machinery. So they use the physical labor, and this is the small hoes, which is quite also high. Uncertainty, they are all high in this scenario. And then, we ended at the presence of early warning systems. Early warning systems could be a very good tool, but the problem is that in Southern Africa, we don't have the technology. So it's high time that the government can invest in the high technology to inform the communities or the farmers on what will happen, to predict the weather in the particular place. Because sometimes we just have there will be rains, rains will be above normal or will be normal. But that is not enough. We just want a specific information that will help us.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. All right, Zulu, that was brilliant. Everyone, thank you so much for that work. That was really useful. So I think what we should do is just take a couple of minutes to see if there are any burning questions about what we've talked about so far, because we're running short on time, but I definitely want to check in and see if there are any burning questions. Either raise your hand or put it in the chat box, and we are all here.
And you can stretch as well.
Oh yeah,
we'll
use
take
this time
we'll
think of an amazing question.
Questions. So everyone
Great
can
idea.
get up and stretch. Come on, Pierre, we want you up.
We have one hand raised from Darian.
Darian, please.
You can unmute yourself, Darian.
I saw that the qualification is in terms of low and high. I mean, it can be medium, it can be other things, but it's qualitative at the moment, you know. But in the end, you can make it quantitative. So some broader explanation of that one, you know, it can be quantitative as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Darian. Sabrina, do you want to?
Yeah, sure.
On that one?
Absolutely. I think, Darian, I was going to put that in the chat box just so we remember to also bring that up. I think that's absolutely. So what we are sort of working towards together right now is the qualitative participatory way of identifying drivers. What you would often do after this is then take those drivers and the qualitative review, and then you match that with quantitative data. So you say, we've seen that qualitatively we think that locusts might be a really high impact driver, and we think this is going to happen in the region. You then, and actually in our group we discussed it a bit about crop and pest modeling, we would then try and match that with quantitative data and say actually it's somewhere in the middle. So absolutely what we're teaching and what we are in the midst of right now is a qualitative way of unpacking scenario narratives. And next week is where we also are going to sort of discuss how you would take these implications and how you would mix them with quantitative data and other methods of then taking your scenarios and putting them into a strategy and a pathway.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Any further question? All right, if we are stretched, great. Thank you again for that, and thanks, Sabrina. You've got us ready to start developing multiple scenarios. Let me just share my screen. Some days better at this than others. All right. So now we are going to move into the next steps of our process for developing scenarios. We're going to talk about building multiple scenarios. And if I can just get my screen to advance. Okay. So what we've just been talking about is that we have gone through identifying whether we have high impact or high uncertainty, and that's just been a great exercise. And so now what we want to do is focus in on those that are high impact and highly uncertain. And so that is step 5. So as an example, if you had your drivers, they may be from different categories, as we've mentioned. And so in the case that we're about to go through, we identified 4 drivers and that were both high impact and highly uncertain. And so I'd like to play those through. So now we move to step 6, where we're setting up the scenario axes. So scenario 1, we are actually going to look at national borders. This is around the level of regional integration, and that came up very important in an earlier exercise. So when we start to develop our scenario axes, we want to pick the driver for each axis, and we are going to identify kind of the extremes around that. So if we're looking at a level of regional integration, we might have at one extreme national borders closing, and at the other one, fully functioning regional integration. So in this scenario 1, we're also going to be looking at youth unemployment. So we're going to look at a range from low youth employment to high youth unemployment. So this is what it looks like when we say we're going to set up our axes. So for scenario 1, we're very keen to know, to start to develop our scenario storylines within this context. This will be the first one we run. So the second step, I don't know why I keep leaving this. The second step, next step is about actually building those scenario storylines now that we've set up our axes. And again, what we found is that it's very useful so that you don't forget a specific, say, category inside of these axes. As you're developing your storylines, it's quite useful to look at, to actually lay out different dimensions. Maybe I should use that word. So when I'm setting up my axes, I've named my axes, I've put the extremes, and then what I would love to do is to unpack, what does it mean? What would it look like where you might have high regional integration and high youth unemployment? So each of these quadrants reflects how 2 of these drivers meet. Okay, so let's just try an example. So if I were looking at, and I'm now down in the lower right quadrant, where I've got high youth unemployment and national borders closing, I'm going to ask you to think about economic dimension, investment, trade. What do we think if I were in the quadrant where it's high youth unemployment and high nationalism or borders closing? What would the economy look like? what might the economy look like in such a future state where these two things are happening? So we're going to go to the chat box and see, you are now just writing a sentence to say, what would the economy look like in a situation where you have high youth unemployment and high nationalism or borders closing? Anybody?
So you're now learning how to build these scenario narratives. So we're in 2030. What does the economy look like? We've got lots of youth with no jobs, and we have really low integration regionally. What does the economy look like? Difficult, struggling,
Right.
Increased informality.
Ooh.
There'll be a low standard of living. Dead. Uh-oh, our economy will be dead. Oh no, chaos.
Chaos.
An iPhone, it would be great to know your name so we can, high crime.
Oh, that's Sandile, I
No,
think.
Sunshine has said low growth, Abalek. Jennifer said it would be unstable. Mungani said not functioning at all. So
Okay.
we're seeing constrained, low market. Great.
All right. That's
Nathaniel
brilliant.
says increased poverty levels and crime rates. So you're starting to see this storyline.
Fantastic. All right. So we're just going to quickly look at some examples. Those are excellent. So what we're looking at now is if we were to place a sentence or two describing the 5 dimensions that we've talked about, we would get a sense of more specific scenario storylines or narratives for that scenario. So we're saying yes, all of those things that you've just played out, where immigration, people are leaving, that would be really important in terms of also socio-cultural, and then I saw a number of other ones, poverty. So we would see some real changes also in socio-cultural. We might see changes around, I love these that are all very difficult, but we're going to try and be a little more specific in our storylines. So these are just some examples so that once you've played through in this quadrant, you've got a sense of what that future, those possible futures might look like under those situations. So now in scenario 1, let's try one more. Now what I'd like to do is look at the sort of other extreme where you've got good regional integration, good trade going on, and you have low youth unemployment. What do we think that the agricultural production system might look like? What would be your narrative statement about the agricultural production system were we to have low youth unemployment and high regional integration? Okay. So moved into a different quadrant.
So this is now a different storyline that you would build because it's a slightly different future that we're seeing to emerge.
Great.
Increased production, increased income, perhaps more technologically advanced due to increased standards, requirements, and involvement, diverse productivity, sound careers for youth, improved livelihoods, improved health, a stable economy, immigration, increase in trade, increased agricultural productivity. So with low unemployment and more regional, productive and mechanized agricultural system with low labor intake. Growth rate will be high. Landlocked countries will be smiling.
Oh, that's brilliant. So see, this is fantastic because you also took from the agricultural productivity, you put some storylines specifically on productivity, and you also touched on other dimensions in terms of the markets, in terms of innovations, in terms of infrastructure. So you can start to get a sense that you are really describing what that future state could look like. All right, so with that, we have just a few examples, and I think it's not always going to be just win-win. You may find that even if you had high regional integration and low youth unemployment, you may see that the countries are getting quite a bit of increase in income, some to work with in their budgets, but they may focus potentially on something besides social safety nets or empowerment. So there's sort of, you can get a little bit of a both and in each one of those. So I just want to, if I can take 1 minute to look at a second scenario where we look at low climate risk to high climate risk. And we've already talked about that one. And then low disease prevalence or spread to high disease prevalence or spread. Again, we would build a new axis to show those going from low to high on both sides. And then we would start to unpack the scenario storylines for that. And so, for example, in a high risk, climate risk and high disease prevalence, we could very well see widening wealth gap, food and nutrition insecurity, school dropouts. There are a number of different storylines that will play out in this possible future. All right, so as we've mentioned, you have, I think it was Susanna asked, you can brainstorm on many drivers, and then you sieve it down to those that are high and high. And so then you have an opportunity to continue to run these scenarios. So we've done 2, but you could run many. And it's really nice when you juxtapose things from different dimensions. So what we've done is one like on health versus climate risk. So that is really the way we go on developing those scenarios. So we can do many, and then we have the opportunity to work with those storylines. So just as a quick review, we've gone through the 7 steps of building scenario storylines. And what I would invite now is I am going to take my screen down, and I'm going to invite Leslie to share some examples of the work that's been done to date. Thank you so much for running through building scenarios with me.
And while Leslie puts up her screen, if anybody's got any questions on those steps, just let us know so we can start lining up for the final Q&A.
Shit. Wait. Sorry. Sorry, you guys. Go. Got it?
We can see your screen.
It keeps going.
Let me share.
Hold on.
Leslie, just click on the at the bottom of the screen, the slide share, the presentation button. So it's at the bottom.
It keeps kicking me back to.
Yeah, no, but not the first one. This one. But you are on the first slide, right?
Yeah. So let me. You can see how much we've learned.
Fast recap.
This will wake everybody up. I'm sorry, you guys. They're getting better, but not totally there. All right, but what I'm going to do now is tell you a little bit about some of the results from a summary of recent work in the SADC region and globally, sub-Saharan Africa, SADC region and nationally, on scenarios that are relevant to climate resilient livelihoods. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples and show you what they came up with in terms of axes, problems, and approaches. The first one I'm going to show you was a quantitative analysis. It was from the Institute for Future Studies and ISS. This is from 2012. And basically they use an international futures model, and they were trying to figure out, okay, will increasing agricultural productivity give better diets for poor people in Africa? And they ran 3 scenarios, a base case that is kind of sort of a positive business as usual. Then they looked at green revolution. So their main issue here was, if you just increase productivity a lot, what implications does that have for poor people's diets? And they found that it didn't, just increasing productivity wasn't enough. And so you actually had to put in some measures to help poor people be able to buy food, like safety nets. So their key uncertainty in this analysis was whether or not you put in measures to facilitate the ability of poor people to buy food. But it was a quantitative model. Then moving on, we have another example on water. This is a national level example from South Africa, the World Wildlife Fund. This is an example of a participatory scenario where they had a stakeholder group built of people with backgrounds in water industries. It's from 2017. You can see here the 2 axes. They were abundance of water and scarcity of water, and low socioeconomic development, high socioeconomic development. And their key uncertainties was about water abundance and the socioeconomic development. The external driver here was much more around the scarcity and abundance of water, whereas the socioeconomic development was something that the group themselves had it's an internal driver that they could influence. Another case, and this is a pretty interesting one, I thought, this is one of the few that was actually at SADC level. It's called Building Climate Resilience Through Virtual Water and Nexus Thinking in SADC. And the question was, what are the non-political drivers of change in the SADC region? And they're looking at the water, particularly in the management of water, although actually there's a fair amount of political as well, but they say non-political. They look at the drivers of climate change, and there's a lot of uncertainty on that. Another big driver, though, is the interaction between countries in SADC in managing water, sort of what they call the hydropolitical complex. And then the ability of individual states to cooperate, which is somewhat related to the second one, but more broad. What this one indicated was that, big uncertainties of how much there's going to be localized water shortages, how that's going to affect electricity, how that would affect the economy and unemployment. And then what would the political response be to managing those water shortages? Would there be ability to cooperate and transfer water, either explicitly water or in products across the SADC boundaries? That was done with just one expert opinion. The next ones are some examples of recent ones done by the AFRICAP project. That's a DFID funded project. These are from 2018. They're 4 country level ones. And they were looking here about, supporting policy decisions on the future of agricultural systems. And they have Zambia, South Africa, Tanzania, and Malawi. Each case, they had high and low climate risk. That was always one of the axes. The other axes were developed through participatory scenarios for each country. So for example, in Zambia, it was high and low market connectivity. And again, you see the example of, this is an internally controllable, not totally, but much more than the climate change risk of the group that was involved. In the case of South Africa, land reform was the main, besides climate change, that was the main source of uncertainty. When we move to Tanzania, you can see technology transformation, particularly agricultural technology in the private sector and public sector investment in ag technology and how it would transform the agricultural sector. And then we have Malawi, where policy, the good or bad policy implementation, and a lot of that was coordination. That was a key issue. Now, in all of those, you start to see also in these country level ones, these features of a desired future. So for example, the Tanzania one, that they came up with, across all the scenarios, they were looking at that farmers had adopted new crop varieties with traits, and that increased resilience to climate change. It's not in every scenario, but in every discussion of what the desired future was. Sorry, I was not quite clear. This is something that came across regardless of the kind of climate risk that's being faced. Okay, in the next part, I'm just going to give you a really quick overview of some of the summary of SADC level drivers, what they look like and what the uncertainties are. So on this slide, we have the effectiveness of regional integration. We talked about that a little bit in the breakout. SADC is actually, it's one of the regional economic communities in Africa with an higher interregional trade, but so far, regional integration maybe is not so effective as we'd like to see. It's the uncertainties going over to the right-hand side. What are political and economic crises in individual member countries going to do about facilitating the ability to cooperate? And also South Africa plays a really key role in how well the cooperation goes because it has a dominant role in the economy. And so there's some uncertainty about how that will go. A second driver is sources of economic growth. Right now in the region, services dominate the region's economy. There's a big push in the RISDIP plan to move to grow industry, and there's a lot of uncertainty over that. Can that really be a major source of growth? Level of economic growth, there's been higher levels in other regions, but still not as high as desired or projected. And there's a lot of uncertainties around where that's going to go due to the situation in South Africa, the hydropower issues I was mentioning on the earlier scenario. Income distribution is a major driver of climate resilient outcomes. Its overall worsening trend, the uncertainty is, are they going to be able to put policy measures in place to improve them? And then the last one is import. How much food is going to be imported or produced domestically? And that also goes to how much integration there would be of SADC food trade, and the regional management of water resources, which again, harkening back to the scenario I talked about before. The final thing I want to say here is, in doing this summary, looking across these scenarios, you start to see certain things at the SADC level that come out as common and divergencies, common visions and divergencies. So I'd say it's pretty common across all of them that higher levels of equality in income distribution is a desired feature. Improved conservation and management of natural resources, desired across pretty much all of them. Reduction in food imports, increased investments, education and health, and in infrastructure. Those come across, even with really a lot of different kinds of focus and approaches. Where you start to see differences, though, is that how important is the regional government and how important is it versus more decentralized form of government? What should the regional government's role be, just facilitating or a stronger role? The relative importance of small-scale farming sector to the economic growth. Is this important? Are they going to contribute, or is it more like a sector that we have to maintain incomes and food security without it being a major source of economic growth? The degree to which the region is inward or outward is a bit of a debate on the trade status and also a little bit on the food import, food export. And then there's a lot of discussion as you get into the pathways of like, well, what is it actually going to take to get to any of these ideal futures? Okay, that's that. Now we can move to Q&A.
Thank you so much, Leslie. If you want to stop your screen share so we can invite you to the Q&A. And we have, we just got about 7 minutes before we wrap up. So if there's anyone who wants to raise their hand, this can be any questions to anyone on the panel, from the breakouts, from what you've just seen, from the 7 steps of the scenario method we've talked you through. Any questions, just let us know. So I will start off with Gwen, who said, how do we link parallel initiatives? Wonderful work here with the government planning teams, e.g. the National Agricultural Marketing Council and Bureau for Food and Agricultural Policy. Are they doing the planning for the new agricultural master plan? So I think Gwen is based in South Africa. So it's basically, I think, asking through the scenario method how you could potentially link parallel initiatives and policy planning. So Leslie, do you want to take a stab at that one?
It's definitely a stab. Because I was just thinking, okay, what would I do? Well, I'd get the people that are working on both of them in the same room, and I'd get them to start talking about the drivers that are involved in each of their processes, and then imagining what kind of future they're interested in, and looking at, you know, what we just did. What are the big drivers? What are the uncertainties? And but that includes both of those policy processes. So yeah, how do you meet with the South African government? Well, that's one I'm not going to answer. I toss back to Sabrina.
No, I think that was a good stab at that answer, Gwen, and we can also elaborate a little bit more. At the end of the webinar, we always do a Q&A response, which we load onto the website. I want to just also go to Kenneth's question, where he says, what are the best methodologies that would work to include rural farming communities in embracing climate and weather and information? And actually, right at the beginning, Justice had asked Leslie a question to say, how would we include smallholder farmers into a scenario exercise? So although not quite the same question, I think it's getting at the same thing in terms of inclusivity, and how do we also bring in the sort of like at the farm scale level into a scenario exercise and embracing some of those changes that we might be seeing from the information emerging. Constance, do you want to quickly respond to that?
Sure. Thanks so much to both. I think that just to start quickly on how could you do this at a farming community, I think it would not be really challenging. I mean, we've talked about the whole of the foresight process, but if we focus in on scenarios, I mean, this could readily be done through a very participatory exercise to get people to think about sort of those, what we've been calling quadrants, but you could set it up maybe in a little bit different way, so that you really said, okay, what would happen? You know, what if we had, you know, a lot of problems with climate change, and we also had, you know, another driver, for example, say it was a pest on the farm. So you could start to think about those possible futures in the most local way. You don't necessarily have to draw axes and get people to write things. You could actually just start to think in different sort of scenario quadrants. In terms of integrating climate change information, I think this is a really important question, because one of the things that we talked about, and I would say Claire really focused on this, is that so much of the information that we have is not localized. But it's really important that whatever information we do have, that it's provided in a very visually accessible way to get the points across. So, so I'm sorry that we don't have that, maybe the weather data, the climate data at the most local level, but no matter what you're able to present, it has to be in a very easy to take in way. If others want to add.
Just quickly, want to get onto Nathaniel's question here. How best can we make it work in terms of integrating national and regional scenarios? And Leslie, I will hit that back to you as well.
Yes, because actually I had experience with that. I mean, it's a good question, and it's difficult. It's really difficult because people do have different, it's not just their assumptions, they have different priorities. So, you know, the scenario building process is also coming to grips with those differences. So in one case, we had a Vietnamese national scenario, and then we also worked on a regional scenario for Southeast Asia. And the priorities, like one of the examples I gave before was about the role of China. And there was a lot of disagreement between the regional level and the national level. So in the end, at first it was a really useful discussion to get that you understood that, you know, it was uncertain and people had very different ideas about it. In the end, the scenarios that were built there were not just two by two. There were more axes. You can actually make much more complicated looking scenarios. For now, it's better just to stick to the 2 by 2. But in that case, there was like 5 key uncertain drivers that were considered, and part of that was a bit of a compromise between the regional and the national, or not a compromise. It was including both. So that was a very useful exercise, but it took also like 4 days of intensive workshop.
Great, thank you. And just would build on what Leslie said. I mean, I guess because we're teaching in this virtual world, we have to try and keep some of the sort of steps and concepts as easy to kind of convey. But in terms of what Constance was getting at, and we'll talk about this a lot at the beginning of next week when we try and unpack scenarios, is we've shown you one method around a quadrant where you pick, you have to sort of pick two uncertainties, but very much next week we'll be discussing about how in your work you could tailor that, you could build rapid scenarios, or you could even look at different uncertainties if those are important. So we're teaching you a method here, but this is applicable and can be changed depending on sort of your context and how you want to use scenarios. So just any more burning questions, or if anyone wants to raise their hand for sort of the last word. Grace has just given an example in terms of implementing a project that provided information services via SMS. And really that the key to success is training farmers to interpret the information. So I think building on that question around engagement with local communities, I think the interpretation and how to then implement. So if we're thinking of, if we see something that's emerging in a scenario exercise, teaching both kind of interpretation and then what do you do when you see that message and how do you respond to it. Yeah, I think in terms of last questions, if there's anything more people can register. If not, and we will get back to those after the seminar, and we're going to try and close at 4 on the dot. So Constance, would you like to share your screen and wrap up?
Absolutely.
And please continue to add any more questions and we can make sure that we will respond to those in the Q&A and load those onto the website. And Lily can share that link again.
Yes, we look forward to those. All right, so can we just check in and see how we're feeling now? Has there been any change since we started? And we have added a few extras. So how are you feeling now? We've added in ready to run a scenario, motivated and ready for the next webinar, and yikes, you've given us too much information.
And I hope we don't have anyone in slow motion, but we'll see. Okay, we've got about 30% of the vote. Anyone just capturing your last kind of views of how you're doing? Great, a couple more votes and then I think we can close it up.
Okay.
Super. Great, I think Pierre, we can close up the poll.
Yeah, I'm going to share the result now. The results now, so you should be able to see them.
Wow. So the majority are motivated and ready for the next webinar. Oops, we've got a few with too much information. So we will continue to reiterate what we've been sharing. And I'm happy that people are still fantastic, energized, pretty good. And we still have a few that are staying in slow motion. So don't know what time zone they're on. But thank you so much. And with that, I just want us to just review the learning outcomes. So we focused this entire webinar on scenario building and scenarios. So we've hoped that we've conveyed the importance and application of scenarios in the Foresight method, that we now understand how to categorize and identify those high impact, high uncertain drivers, that we can set up a scenario matrix and draft some future scenarios. And we're really appreciative to Leslie for sharing the summary of work in the region. It was extremely valuable. So as we move and get ready for the next webinar, next time we're actually moving into the reflection mode. So what we want to do is we want to understand, okay, what would we want to do differently now that we have set out these future scenarios, future states. So we'll look at scenario implications, we'll look at transformational change, transformation elements, and how can we then build more robust climate resilient policies and plans. So we're really excited about that. And just lastly, we'd like to once again ask you to fill in a ticket out in the chat box. If you would, tell us if you've had a learning that you'd like to report back on with an L. And if you have any comments for the training team. So for example, those that thought maybe I've gotten too much information, if you want to say something to us, a little more detail about that. So we'll look forward to those inputs. And if we could invite everyone. We'll see you next Wednesday at the same time. And we could invite anyone to please come on just on the video for a moment so that we can say goodbye. It's
bye, everybody.
Absolutely brilliant to work with you all.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much for your time.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you.
Thank you. And oh, good. Thank you for registering those learnings and comments. We really appreciate those. They help us with getting ready for the next one. And
See you next week.
Next week.
See you next
Thank
week.
You.
Bye, Temitope.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks so much. Thank you, Vincent.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. 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 See you next week.
Bye, Jacob.
Bye-bye.
Thanks also Claire, Amanda, Lily, and I lost Laura for helping us with the facilitation in the breakout. Yes. And Philip, of course.
Thank you to everybody.
No problem. It was fun.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye, Susanna.
Thank you, Susanna.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm glad we moved you from slow motion to looking forward to the next webinar. That's a good outcome.
Thank you, everyone, for your participation.
Bye, Kati. Drive safe.
Yes,
we can
please.
see you in the car. Drive safe.